Welcome back to Course of Action. My guest today is author M.P. Woodward. M.P. is a former Navy intel officer turned techie turned streaming guru, which we're going to get into here in this episode. Now he's the author of Tom Clancy's Shadow State, as well as his previous books, Dead Drop and The Handler. We're going to get into all that with M.P. right now. This is the Course of Action podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, and the Reeves Across America radio network. Watch every episode live on YouTube and check out the blog post on jeffclarkofficial.com. All right, so I got MP Woodward on with me today. How are you doing? And thank you again for doing this.
Hey, Jeff, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. And newest Tom Clancy author. How's that feel?
Feels great. It's been a wild ride.
So you were a former Navy intel officer, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
How long were you in the Navy?
About 10 years.
Oh wow, 10 years. Did you go any places crazy overseas or anything like that?
Yeah, most of it was overseas actually. So a lot of time in first part of my career in Southeast Asia, and then later in the Persian Gulf.
Okay. So the ramp up in the Asia Pacific stuff that's going on right now is kind of right up your alley then.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to work for the U.S. Pacific Command, which is now called the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, but back then it was just the U.S. Pacific Command. And so, yeah, we spent a lot of time. That's run by a four-star admiral who controls joint operations, and that theater tends to be an admiral, just sort of the same way that CENTCOM tends to be an army general.
Right. Yeah, because of the nature of the what's going on over there. And I knew my last colonel that I worked for, he went over to PACAF, which is the Air Force Pacific
Mm-hmm.
Command, and he was like the chief of logistics, and he was just like he left about a year ago, and he was just like praying. He was like, I really hope things don't kick off while I'm there, because he knew how busy he was going to be being chief of logistics. And I was like, sir, listen, I'm gonna be honest with you. You're going to be a busy man over there. Don't plan on taking leave or anything like that. Like,
It's hard to imagine a more challenging job because the distances in the Pacific are so vast and varied that yeah, it's a tough one.
what do you think is the biggest like intelligence threat when it comes to that area of the world right now?
Well, I mean, it starts with China, and I think when it comes to China, in terms of an intelligence threat, I think it's really industrial espionage because we live in an age where war has changed, where it's like, hey, it's there's the line is very blurred between the defense industry that makes bullets and bombs and the technology industry that makes artificial intelligence and the semiconductors that power all the smart weapons. And so all those things are munged together and depending on the same technology to be effective. So it's in China's interest to steal whatever U.S. Enterprise might be working on, and I think that's a significant threat.
And I think, to further your point, the amount of catching up the Chinese military has done is, I'm no intel expert myself, but just looking at what all they've accomplished in their short amount of time rivals what we've accomplished in 200 years of military, service. It's insane what they've done, and how did they do that? They had to do it by copying formulas that were beforehand, and I think we know that they've stolen stuff from us before, but industrial espionage, you just said, is a very interesting topic, I think, because you're absolutely right. How did they catch up and do all that work in such a little time to rival us now? They took a shortcut.
Well, sure, and I think intellectual property theft has been an issue with China for many years. So there are certainly There's certainly a targeted intelligence effort against U.S. industry, but I think also the Chinese devoted, more capital to building a big navy. As our navy has gotten smaller, and we've struggled, I think, with the defense investment as a percentage of GDP. China's has grown, and so they passed us in the number of ships and they're putting out these big Type 55 destroyers that we would typically call cruisers that are extremely capable, and they're minting them very quickly when our fleet is aging, and it's something that is of great concern to me.
Yeah, it's a huge concern, and we were talking about this. Me and some of my colleagues were talking about this. Like, where do we see the next conflict going? Of course, there's stuff going on in the Israel-Iran part of the world, and the Middle East seems to be kind of cooking up again. But will a war with China be bombs and bullets, or will it be something else? You mentioned cyber or industrial espionage. I think a cyber is going to be a huge part of it, but I'd like to get your take.
I believe that the next war will begin. The Pearl Harbor of that war will happen in space, because the all these weapon systems, all this, everything that we talk about is all linked together and networked, and that can't happen in a theater of war. Certainly not one as vast as the Pacific, without satellites and low Earth orbit satellites and everything staying connected. And data links and relays can only get you so far. And so I'm pleased that we have a U.S. Space Force. I think that I don't have any special insight into what they do, but I can imagine that based on what's publicly available, that we look at both offensive and defensive weapon systems there. But I think it starts there, and then I think it's a race for Taiwan, partly because China wants it as a lost province, and partly because we need it, because about 90% of the world's AI chips come from out of one company, TSMC, there in Taiwan. And I worked for a Taiwanese company. I'm fairly familiar with this, and we are working hard, I think, to diversify there and have subsidized chip plant building here. But there's a window of time where I think that this makes sense for China to try to exploit, and that's what concerns me.
I was actually working for Air Force Space Command when Air Force or the U.S. Space Force stood up. So we
Got it.
converted overnight from Space Command to Space Force headquarters there in Colorado Springs, and we stood up Space Operations Command and the other commands underneath it. But I did that for about a year in Colorado Springs, and I mean, historical moment that you stand up a new military service. Nobody alive has really seen that. I mean, that's
Yeah, it reminds you of 1947, right? Was when the Air Force split off from the Army. And look, it happens. We evolve. New weapons platforms evolve into new media, and so I think it's very logical.
yeah. So I was doing a little social media creeping this morning, and I ran across something that you posted on your Instagram, an article that you crafted about the Chinese spy balloon and why it was scarier than it looked.
Yeah,
Would you dive into that a little bit and tell us why it was a bigger deal?
yeah. So China. We were just talking about the Space Force, and the U.S. has invested a lot in, orbiting platforms. China has as well, but they have been much more aggressive in something that they call near space. And there's this Cayman line, the generally accepted point where the atmosphere ends and space begins is, I think it's 100,000 feet. It's called the Cayman line. And China has basically said, look, you know what? Air breathing platforms, they're at 60 or 70,000 feet, but there's this ability to operate below space with ultra high altitude platforms. Some of these might include, solar powered gliders or things of that nature that have some attributes in terms of intelligence collection that are actually easier than space. They're cheaper, they can be more efficient, and they can give you loiter time that's much longer. The other thing is that because they're small and lightweight, they avoid detection. And when that spy balloon came cruising over Alaska, I think there were some red-faced Air Force generals at NORAD. And if you parse the words that they use, what they were basically saying is that we don't really tune our radars for stuff like that because there's dense clouds or there's birds or whatever that we're filtering out, and these balloons got filtered out. And so I think China has, if you go and start doing a little research on it, they've had generals and admirals in the PLA who've written doctrinal papers about near space and using things just right below the Cayman line that I don't think that we've been thinking all that much about intercepting. But if you put up thousands of balloons because it's cheap, it's a good way to create a mesh network in the sky.
So why didn't we take care of it sooner? Because it traveled down from Alaska and then over Montana and several of our very important nuclear bases. Why didn't we take care of it earlier, in your opinion?
I think we should have, but I'm speculating here. I think at the time we were looking at, as you'll recall, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had a trip planned to China right then. And when I started looking into this because I wrote that piece, one of the interesting things that came up was, how sanctioned was this really by Xi Jinping, who had some interest in wanting to keep relations warming with the U.S. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, which is the blanket name for the Chinese armed forces, they're a highly political animal within the Communist Party leadership, and there's some thinking out there that says that, well, some folks within the PLA intentionally put that balloon out there to throw off warming relations, and that Xi Jinping was pretty ticked off about it, and that he didn't necessarily mastermind that himself. It was sort of a break in the chain of command. I don't know if that's true or not, but there are certainly some that speculate. And I think similarly on our side, there was a scramble to say what would be the political fallout of shooting this down. I think we overthought that a little. I don't think right. Okay, well, it's a spy balloon. It's right here. At regular citizens can see it with their binoculars, uh, and obviously we came to the conclusion to shoot it down. But it had crossed the entire United States and over some significant missile bases along the way.
Yeah, and how they painted it to be was this was something that Xi Jinping knew about and he
Hmm.
endorsed and like no big deal. But if what you're saying is correct, or even if there's a sliver of it being correct, that there might be some differences in opinion between him and the PLA, that's huge.
Well, we saw Xi Jinping change the command structure of the PLA within the last year. He has, hired and fired people, and I do think that there are some within the PLA who are much more aggressive. Every now and then their comments slip out into the media, and any large organization, even an iron-fisted dictatorship, is going to be difficult to control in our modern world. So maybe he masterminded all of it. Maybe it was some grand design, or maybe not. I don't know, and I've heard theories from both sides.
Hmm. One last question before I want to move into some of the tech and streaming stuff that you've got some experience in. Do you think China wants a conflict with us, whether it's conventional cyber or anything like that? What does that do to economies?
Well, I don't think that China necessarily wants an open conflict. And if you read the famous Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, he says winning 100 battles is not success. Getting what you want without fighting them is success. And I think that is closer to China's wishes than outright exchanging blows. And to do, there is no question that in Xi Jinping's, I believe it's called the Great Rejuvenation, that he has set, hey, we're going to retake Taiwan one way or the other, within the next 10 years. But I believe they think that they can sort of absolve the will of the U.S. in terms of defending that. The reality is that I'm not sure that that's realistic, at least in the near term, given our dependence on Taiwanese semiconductors.
Okay. Okay. I agree. I think they've been very vocal about taking Taiwan, but I do feel like sometimes they're a little wishy-washy about on how serious they are about going to war with the US and potential allies and kind of going I feel like they've backpedaled that just a little bit, and
Yeah.
go, "Ugh,"
Well, it's the old, poke the bear, the sleeping giant, and I think that they are that if you were them, you would say, all right, if the United States is going to be this clear adversary, we need to do everything we can to blunt the deterrence that the United States has and increase the deterrence that we have while weakening them politically and weakening their political will such that when we do exert our influence, it's we're not so scared. We're we the Chinese are not so afraid of the U.S. and the U.S. is very afraid of us. And I think that has been the backstage plan for the last several years and has driven the military buildup of which we were speaking earlier.
So let's move into what you did after you left the Navy, doing the intel officer thing, and then you went into tech, into streaming. What did you do in that space, and how did you get into that?
Yeah. So when I decided to leave the Navy, it was kind of that mid career point, and frankly, at the time, it was right before 9/11. And if you'll recall back then, we were in a period defense wise where we were drawing down from the Cold War. So frankly, the Navy needed less people, and private industry was just taking off. And I had gotten very familiar with internet protocol technologies in my work as an intelligence officer because so much of that is really just bouncing information around from place to place, and that was kind of at its infancy at that time, and I wanted to translate that into commercial success, and so I went over into networking and ended up in a startup that was called Packet Video. And at the time, we raised a whole bunch of money, and we were doing video streaming over wireless. And this is, about the year 2000. And at that time, the idea of video over wireless was crazy because it was like 9.6 kilobits per second. But some of the really smart guys that I worked with, we all came out of Motorola. They had figured out how to do it, and then that was my introduction into the wireless world, and then went on to several different jobs in the wireless industry, and ended up at Amazon, and it went full circle because streaming media became the dominant application that drove bandwidth throughout all those network experiences, and then at Amazon worked in with Prime Video. So it felt kind of good to close out my career where it began in terms of streaming media.
That's really cool. Did you see streaming media becoming the giant juggernaut that it is today? I mean, we're replacing cable boxes with it now.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and say yes, I predicted the future perfectly, but what I did see was that back in the year 2000, when we were streaming media over phones, you know, people would say, "Well, who wants to watch a movie on your phone or watch TV on your phone? That's dumb." And you're like, "Well, no, it's because the phones are going to change, right? The chips are going to get faster and the screens are going to get bigger. You'll see." But it was like talking to somebody in 1820 about electricity. They're just like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Right? And so that led to a job that I then had at what is now AT&T, and at the time that I worked in the device part of the business and was working with smartphones. And this is the days of pre iPhone and BlackBerry and Windows Phone and Palm Trio, and then Apple came along. And in that period, same thing, the smartphones were considered like the weird phones. Everybody else was carrying around a flip phone and doing text messaging and triple typing, and I would be at my company going, "No, no, man, this is so much cooler." And they were like, "What are you talking about? It's shaped like a giant, square. Nobody wants that." And I'm like, "Why wouldn't you want this? It's got the whole internet. And look, I can even stream things. It's doing everything that you could want." And so you could sort of you could see this, coming. It was always fun to be at the forefront of it, and it was really when the video on demand issue got solved, because once you could say no, click it, and you can stream the whole thing without interruption, and there's no painful download. This is in the era when we were getting DVDs in the mail from Netflix, and once you got to that point of video on demand, it became very, very clear. And that's why Amazon got into the business, by the way. They were selling DVDs, at Amazon.com. And the next natural extension of that was, well, and so was Walmart. But the next natural extension of that was, hey, instead of waiting for it to come in the mail or rent it, why not just stream it? And here we are.
It's a perfect example of, and I went to business school of going to the customer, taking the product and putting it right in front of the customer's face. And that's what streaming did. Because, and now, you can watch some movies 2 months after they've been in a theater, a month after they've been in a theater, you right from your couch. So you don't even have to go to the theater anymore, which changes, the dynamics of, those companies. But it's very cool how it's changed like that. And now we have things at our fingertips. And 20 years ago, people are going, why would I want that? Why would I want to watch a movie from my phone or read a book from my phone or anything like that? You're going to want to, trust me. And getting people to buy that idea is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think that you speak to something that every business wants to do, which is to remove friction and to provide a good customer experience. So yeah, if you can have a customer click, 2 clicks and it's there,
Done, yeah.
why wouldn't you? And then once customers get kind of comfortable with, hey, I can own this digital asset in the cloud. Well, then what other digital assets can I have? I can have a book from Audible. I could have music, right? All of them are similar. And sure, lo and behold, none of us walk around with physical assets anymore. We just have applications that dig into a cloud and a service where we enjoy them.
Yeah, and you remove the thought process behind it. So people don't have a chance to question their purchase when it's just click, click, and done.
It is certainly easier, right? You're like, what's
Yeah.
$3? Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Why do I have all these Amazon boxes showing up every single day? It's because it's
Yeah.
so convenient to do it, and it's almost kind of scary. I actually saw a picture the other day. There's a picture of a person standing behind a desk, and on the desk had all these devices: cassette player, CD player, calendar, all the things that you put in this that are in this were in physical form on this desk. And the amount of devices and things that were on there, it was crazy to think all of that is now into this little
Yeah.
square. It's crazy, the technology, but I'm using it for military applications and all that. And Silicon Valley is doing some cool stuff. And you actually did like a discussion in Silicon Valley back this spring about
Yeah.
naval strategy and modern starfish era. What
Yeah.
is the starfish era? Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, sure. There is a famous book called "The Starfish and the Spider," and the author's name is not off the tip of my tongue, but it's a really well known book and read in business circles. And the theory behind it is that, or the thesis behind it is that in a spider organization, there's like, one person in control, or one entity in control and farming things out. And so that's a centralized, sort of traditional hierarchical business framework. And in a starfish, he uses that analogy because a starfish is unique in its cellular makeup, in that each of the individual cells at the end kind of thinks for itself. And so if a piece gets broken, it reinserts, it makes its own decision. Basically, it doesn't have a CPU. It doesn't have a brain per se. And so that was about, using that as an analog. That was about how does that change with military strategy, which is, traditionally extremely hierarchical and centralized. But in this era of smart weapons, of AI, of extensible applications on the battlefield over extended ranges, how do you equip the warfighter with the intelligence and capability to make really smart decisions on his own? And ultimately, is that starfish model, better because it's more adaptable than the spider model. And I think it's somewhere in between, to be perfectly honest, because you still need to have people that have the big picture, and I think the people with the big picture can be closer to the battle more than ever. But it gets back to that dependence on technology and communications. And again, that's why I think, like, well, that starfish model is great, but what happens when you take out the satellite network that connects it all? So I don't think there's any one single solution that's perfect here. I think that it involves a lot of redundancy.
Yeah, and our dependency on technology is almost a weak point. Like you said, if the battle was in space and the Chinese knocked out a bunch of our satellites and interconnected systems, and we go dark and we're blind for a lot of different capabilities, from the battlefield to the airfield, et cetera, you know, what do we do? That's a big, huge vulnerability.
Well, and not only communications, think about GPS. I mean, GPS functions, that's something that we invented and effectively gave to the rest of the world as a technology standard. And now the other militaries are dependent on it too. But so many weapon systems depend on GPS to get you to the right place, right? Now they depend on other things, and there's inertial navigation and there's optical based navigation, all these kinds of things. But it would seriously cripple many systems if that were to be knocked out. So it seems logical to me that, okay, if a military is dependent on that and you had the ability to take it away, you would take it away and you would try to back up with something else.
Yeah. So let's talk about writing. When did you first sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a book, and come up with the concept for The Handler, which was your first book, right?
Yeah, I had always been and super inspired by fiction, particularly military fiction and military history. And I grew up reading that stuff and being a fan of history. And so when I went into the Navy, I was witnessing all this really cool stuff. And one of the great things about being an intelligence officer is that, on the one hand, you're not like, the commando jumping out of the plane with a knife between your teeth, but you are closer to the decision makers, right? And the sort of the analytical side of things. And so it got me exposed to many different kinds of warfighters and how they might think, et cetera. So it kind of gave me this background. So I tried a couple times when I was younger to write, and didn't know what I was doing, and they were pretty awful. And then I went into private industry that was super busy, and raising a family, and all the things that we do. I just put it out of my head, didn't have time. And then COVID came around, and by the time COVID came around, I had been working with Prime Video and met some screenwriters and those kinds of things. And I thought, you know what? Now that I've seen how professionals think about storytelling in this age of streaming media, could I combine that with what I learned as an intelligence officer and what I always wanted to do in terms of writing, and do that in a book? And so I did that during COVID because I had more time. My commute went away, and I'm an early morning person, and so I would get up and work on it. And then I sent it off to. I wrote it, and I thought, wow, this is, I actually think it's not terrible, and wrote it and sent it off to agents, and got picked up by very very quickly by Penguin Random House. And the editor happened to be the same guy that does the Tom Clancy series. And that's probably a little bit of a chicken egg thing as to why I'm here now as part of the Tom Clancy verse, is because he probably saw my writing and thought this is sort of similar, and I like it. And then after The Handler and Dead Drop, which comes out in paperback, by the way, on August 20th, um, I think that he was like, okay, this seems like a writer who could translate over to Clancy. That's been my journey.
So what was it like when you got that call, and they said, "Hey, we're interested in you taking over for Don Bentley and the Jack Ryan Jr." Well, what was that like? Walk me through that.
Well, I had been uh, so I was still I was on my second book, my second handler book at that point, and things were going well, and I was just beginning to outline a third one, and Tom, my editor, he basically called and said, "Hey, would you be interested in taking this over?" And I, didn't you're like, do I negotiate here and say, well, maybe, right? Like, no, I couldn't do any of that, right? I just jumped right in like an idiot and said, yeah, of course I would, right? I'm super interested in that. And then in the way things work, he ends up talking to your agent about commercial arrangements for that. But it was I think I celebrated. I think I went and I was it was late afternoon here in Seattle. I think I went and poured myself a bourbon in celebration, and the celebration lasted for about 3 hours before triumph turned into like anxiety. Right? Like how oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? I don't know what I'm doing. Oh dear. Right? And so I pretty much got to work on it the next day in terms of making sure I had read all the right books or had them, had access to them. And then I talked to Don Bentley, who was you've probably interviewed Don, and he was going off to do Vince Flynn, and I was on book tour at the time, and so I went and met with him in Austin, and we talked about it. Mark Greeny, another guy who's done a lot of Clancy books, super generous with his time. I talked to him about it, so I just started gathering information and start, the old eat the elephant one bite at a time, and those were the first couple bites.
Yeah, Mark's one of like the only guys to actually have worked with Clancy before he passed away. So Mark is like he's like one of the legends when it goes back to that, and he's had so much experience. And we talked about it a little bit, and he's so humble about it too. And I
Oh,
asked him,
he's a great guy. Yeah,
"You got
no,
to work
Mark.
with Clancy. What was that like?" He's like, "Oh yeah, it's great." Like
Yeah,
so cool about it. I'm like, I would have been freaking out. I would have lost my mind if I got to sit
yeah.
in the same room as him. And Mark was so cool about it that I was like, man, that's why you're who you are.
I agree. He's got the right temperament for that, and obviously has the right skills for it.
So you get the call, you agree to it, you go through the chaos of holy crap, now I got to come up with an idea. When did the idea for this one really solidify in your brain and really felt like that push going forward?
Well, my editor said, "Okay, great. I'm glad you're going to do it." We I happened to be going to New York for a meeting with him in a couple weeks anyway, and so we I prepared two or three sort of high level synopses of here's what I'm thinking about, and I really wanted to take Jack Ryan Jr., who and I've read, I had read Don's Jack Ryan Jr. books, and they're great, and I wanted um, to take the character and evolve him a little bit, in that I wanted to mature him. He's about 35 to 38 years old. He's engaged to be married, where I picked it up. And I wanted to put some insights into his character that shows here's the things that he does, and sometimes he makes mistakes. Physically, nobody's perfect, and I thought a fun way to do that, which had only been done once before in the series in a Mike Madden book, but to lead with him being on part of his private business. So he's in Hong Kong trying to close a private equity deal, an acquisition for a company in Vietnam, and in the course of doing that, he uncovers a Chinese industrial espionage ring. And so, to me, it was important to kind of bring in a little bit of that technical business aspect, but relate it to something current and compelling in national security, because that's what the Tom Clancy brand represents.
I really like how you did the business part first because you really set the tone of the book to be like, maybe this isn't going to be as heavy on the action. It's going to be a little bit more about the intrigue and the espionage, and I really liked that. But then it turned into the physical, and
Yeah,
and spoiler alert, folks, Jack has to navigate through Vietnam with someone who's not really physical in that sense of the word, hiking and all that while being hunted. Now people know he's there. He doesn't have help. The campus can't just swarm in and pick him up. So I love how it went from the business dealing is the big thing. He can't get to it as much because he's in the middle of nowhere, up against malaria and all that, and and that was the action piece of it that I really liked because it threw back to more of that espionage um, and sense of it. There's some action. You did great on some of the action scenes, but I love that you kind of took it back to that. It felt a little more um, true to the Clancy brand. You brought some of that forward, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great first book by you.
Thank you. The way I pitched that to the editor, I said I would like to put a little more techno back in techno thriller because Tom Clancy invented that and always did a good job explaining how large organizations, not just how the technology works, but how large organizations are thinking about it and the people who run them and how they interact. And I wanted to throw Junior into the middle of that and also give him some moral dilemmas. The final thing that I really wanted to do was it's been a while since Vietnam has been in the news. Back in the '80s, there were all of the Vietnam War kind of entertainment, and we haven't seen that in quite a while. But Vietnam's back in the news now as an alternative to China in terms of supply chain. So as I set the story there, I wanted to harken back to things that had happened in the Vietnam War. John Clark is a Vietnam vet, for example. And we wanted to create characters who had experienced both the war and were now there in Vietnam in industry.
I interviewed Mike Madden last year, and we talked briefly about the Clancy world and his experience and all that. And we were talking kind of offline, and we were just talking just reminiscing about some of the old books. And he's like, I really want to see somebody do like an old school throwback John Clark novel. I mean, Colt
Mm,
45 in the leather holster type of like
yeah,
real throwback. I was like, oh yes, I love that.
yeah.
I'd buy 50 copies of that. That sounded great. And
Well, now you're giving me ideas.
there
So
you go. Run with it and see what happens. Speaking of ideas, let's talk about next projects. Is there going to be a third handler book? And what do you got cooking in the Clancy world? Don't get yourself in trouble with any spoilers, but
yeah, 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 yeah. No, no. There's a third handler book in the works, and in terms of Clancy, there's a second book that's I think I'm allowed to say it. It's called Line of Demarcation, and that was due back in. I wrote it last year. It was due in June, and is edited and ready to go. So it'll probably launch in about 7 months. Really enjoyed writing that one. John Clark is it's a little closer to what you said. It's not quite his origin story, but we do see him toting a gun. um, and so that's like about 7 months off. And then I have another book that I'm finishing up right now that I don't think I'm allowed to talk about yet, but it's been a super busy year, and I'm about to get started on Clancy 3 with Junior.
wow. So busy year for you, busy year next year. Are you going to
Yeah.
go to BouchCon, Thriller Fest? You got any of those plans?
I will be at Thriller Fest, which won't be until June. BoucherCon's in September. Do you know where it is this year? Because that's
It's in
coming up, right?
Nashville. Yeah, here in a couple of weeks.
There you go. Yeah, so I probably will be at BoucherCon. I haven't. I was planning on going to Nashville for a different reason, but if it lines up, then I probably will. And those would be the two. Those are the two events that I typically go to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. I was just talking to Brad Thor the other day and about Nashville, and I asked him. I said, "It's like 107 here in Oklahoma. Is it cooler in Nashville?" And he's like, "It's gonna be higher too. Just get ready for it." Dang, was hoping for a
Yeah.
break.
Hey man, all those outdoor cafes and beers and music, and I don't mind the heat. I'll take it.
Well, MP, thank you so much for doing this. Where can people go to follow along with you as you're into the Jack Ryan Jr. and you drop your next handler book and to see future projects?
Yeah, I mean, all my social media coordinates are on the back cover of the book there, and anywhere, if anybody wants to look the book up, they'll see it there. But mpwoodward.com and is my website, and my social media is mp_woodward, at Facebook and MPW Author in Twitter.